Quickly moving on. Welcome for I think yet another conversation on union budget, and I think this is almost the eighth or 10th year since we started this. So today's budget has been fairly interesting in terms of how our honorable finance minister has approached the entire sequence of events. If you notice, there has not been any big bang reforms, but a lot of very sensible and I would say like impactful reforms which has been done across various sections, starting from of course the prime minister's pet subject on the gift city, where on IFSC we have seen like loads of regulatory reliefs which have happened. The decriminalization of Companies Act has happened. The decriminalization of LLP Act has just begun. So these are some very, very positive steps, right from expanding the faceless assessments to tribunal hearings. I think the settlement commission has gone for good at this point in time, bringing down the time frame from 6 years to 3 years. I think there are quite a good number of good amendments which have happened. And what is also really interesting to understand is the government is also uh, willing, as you would have, in case we've read the economic survey, one of the important recommendations was, of course, the jargon was there, the counter-cyclical fiscal initiative, but nothing but when the government is not, when the private sector is not investing, the government has to invest. I think that's what uh, the NES, I mean, this CEA had recommended, and I think by and large we have done that. So this is not about the economy at this point. Today's focus would be more on direct taxes, direct tax provisions. So let's quickly jump into it. And before I start, I would like to thank my entire team at DVS for having got the presentation done in record time. We've had almost 70 plus amendments. The budget provisions are about roughly about 65, 70 pages of budget memorandum, which is what has been brought to you at this point. So quickly moving on, friends, we have categorized it in logical parts. So the first one starting with rationalization of provisions. So this is one issue. So if you have the case of an employer deducting a provident fund or ESI payments from employees' salary, and that doesn't get paid on or before due date, there was a relief provision which was available where the benefit will be available on the date of payment. But as our honorable finance minister mentioned on the floor of the house, even if what if the employer goes bust? Then in such cases, the employee's contribution also hangs in a limbo. So to ensure that the employers are pushed, compelled to pay the benefits which they deduct from the employee or as contribution towards benefit welfare funds, the relief under 43B is now been revised. So going forward, the provisions of this uh, section 43B shall not apply to employees' contribution of provident fund, which has to be made on or before the due date as per the specified act. Uh, Moving on. So dispute resolution committee for small and medium taxpayers, this was again mentioned on the floor of the parliament. So what has happened is currently at this point in time, faceless assessment or appeal for faceless assessment is at present operational. And what they're also trying to do, this is something which is available, friends, in the international tax assessments, where we have something called dispute resolution panel, where even before an assessment is complete, you have a right to raise your dispute and then get that sorted by a panel before it becomes an order. Something similar is mentioned here, but not in the same procedural aspect. So one is the central government shall constitute one or more dispute resolution committees for small time SSCs. So when I say small time, where the returned income is 50 lakhs or less, and the aggregate amount of variation proposed is in the order of 10 lakh rupees, so doesn't exceed 10 lakh. So technically we are talking about almost 85 to 90% of the tax return taxpayers will fall within this ambit. the SSE would have an option to opt for or not opt for dispute resolution. And the SSE will be ineligible if an order is passed under section 132, 132A, or 33. Typically talks about a case where there's a search or a seizure or a survey issue, then these provisions will not apply. So again, the government, if you've noticed, they bought in Vivad Se Vishwas to settle pending disputes. So the intent seems to be there is a genuine concerted effort to bring down backlogs in various cases. And as we seen in, I think, last year's economic survey, nearly 80% of the litigations, in nearly 80% of the litigation, the government is the litigant, the primary litigant. So with that in mind, obviously what they've done makes a lot of sense. The board for authority for advanced ruling. So advanced ruling is a scheme of things where even before you enter into a transaction, you write to the government and you get their buy-in on a particular transaction. So let's say you're buying some services from abroad and you want to know what is the tax implications, or you say these are my tax implications, and you don't want any further uh, liability or litigation, you go to them and get their uh, concurrence, their blessing, as we would say. And if that happens, if there is a blessing of the AAR, then the order is binding on the concerned SSE as well as on the assessing officer. Now, what's happened is there has been a serious amount of backlog, because as per the current provision, the bench of AAR cannot function if the post of chairman or vice chairman is vacant. And based on past experience, these positions have been vacant for quite a good number of time for various reasons. So therefore, it is now proposed that the AAR shall cease to operate with effect from once the board is notified. And then you have pending applications with the AAR which has not been passed shall be transferred to the board. And one or more board members of the board, or one or more boards for AAR for advanced ruling, shall be set up by central government. And every such board shall consist of 2 members, each being an officer not below the rank of chief commissioner. Since the work of authority shall be carried out by the Board of Advanced Rulings on or after the notified date, amendments to this chapter are being proposed. If you see the earlier composition of the board members, they were all judges or chief justice of a high court or retired judges of Supreme Court were the ones who were eligible to pass an order in AAR. But at this point, they've now opened it to uh, chief, I mean, what would I say, to an officer not below the rank of principal commissioner, I mean, chief commissioner. And a new section shall be inserted to provide for appeal to High Court against the order passed by the board for advanced ruling. And this appeal can be filed by the applicant as well as by the department. And the central government shall be empowered to notify a scheme for filing appeal by the assessing officer, to bring in efficiency. So this is one, I would say, it's welcome because it brings in speedier process. But the concern is when an order is being passed by uh, the retired judge of a high court or a supreme court, the persuasive value vis-a-vis an order passed by someone from the revenue, and that only time will tell in terms of how effective, but the intention is laudable, definitely. Income escaping assessments and search assessments. So typically what happens is, this is more in terms of reopening of assessments. Again, there's always this concern that in India, uh, tax assessments are never final, and people can go on and on for litigating, or revenue authorities have an endless amount of time to litigate on cases. So the current provision for research assessments under 132 or seizure under 132A, and then the earlier 153, 158 BC block assessments, all these talks about reopening cases for 6 years, 8 years, 16 years under multiple circumstances. So this is where the challenge comes. So now what has been revised at this point is, The time limit for issuing a notice under 148. 148 is for income escaping assessment. For normal cases, the notice to be issued is within 3 years of time. 3 years from the end of the relevant assessment year, provided the permission is granted by principal commissioner. And where it exceeds 50 lakhs or more, then within 10 years from the end of the relevant assessment year, if permission is granted by the principal commissioner of income tax or principal director general. And what is also interesting is, earlier, if you see the language of the law, it was if the assessing officer has a reason to believe. So what was required was a reason to believe. But if you heard the finance minister say, her conversation was more in terms of the AO has to have information, credible evidence to initiate the new procedure. So, which effectively means that in the absence of credible evidence, this reopening may not be possible. So that's again a very welcome step, because once a search assessment is initiated, for those of us who are familiar, it's like filing returns for the past 6 years, and it's the next 4 or 5 years goes only in terms of sorting out the issues. Next, allowing the prescribed authority to issue notice under 142(1). So 142 talks about inquiry before assessment, and it is proposed to amend 1(1). Clause 1(1) gives the assessing officer the authority to issue notice to an assessee who has not submitted a return of income, asking him to submit a return of income. However, at present, the power is only invoked by the assessing officer. It is proposed to amend this and to empower the prescribed income tax authority, besides the AO, to issue the notice under this clause. And here again, what is happening is, given the fact that we are now moving towards a faceless regime, the AO may not be the only person who can issue or who will end up issuing these notices. Eventually, it will be the authorized or the prescribed authority under the faceless scheme. So this amendment is more in terms of making issuing notice compatible with the faceless scheme. And this is a phenomenally welcome initiative, where the government is now talking about proceedings before income tax appellate tribunal also happening in a faceless manner. Friends, as someone who's participated in these hearings, we can say it with certainty, this is one of the biggest reforms which have happened in this space, and it should significantly move India's position in the ease of doing business. Extension of for the date of incorporation of startups. So we had these provisions under 80 IAC where startups had tax holidays, and these tax holidays were eligible as long as their entities were as long as they were set up on or before 1st of April 2021. And given what we have gone through, the government has expanded that by one more year. Now, the next is a case where someone sells a house and puts his money in an eligible startup. So that's a fairly long shot, which the government thought, where people, even when they start business, the first thing they'll do is to sell their house. I mean, no one sells; they'll at least pledge to make money, to raise the money. So 54GB was one such provision, where if you sell your house for investing in an eligible startup, then you don't need to pay capital gains tax. Now that's been, and there again, it was for a limited period ending on 31st of March 2021. It's again extended by one more year. Similarly, for affordable residential housing, the reduction available under 80 has been extended by one more year. So the 1.5 lakh additional reduction for of loan for first-time home buyers will continue to apply for the current the ensuing financial year as well. Now this is interesting, friends. Something which is we were slightly taken, I wouldn't say aback, but yes. So you have various types of insurance policies. So there's this provision 1010D which exempts the sum received under maturity of a life insurance policy. So what happens? Currently, there is no cap on the amount of annual premium paid by any person. So the HNIs typically end up investing a lot of money in mutual funds through ULIPs. So ULIPs squarely fall within the ambit of, it's an investment instrument coupled with an insurance relief. So going by the provisions of 1010D, you can convert an investment instrument into an insurance and claim the benefit. The only condition thus far was that the annual premium should not be more than 10% of the maturity proceeds, but it did not place a threshold on how much you can put. So now uh, the new provision is any ULIP, it's only for unit linked insurance plans issued on or after 1st of February 2021. If the amount of premium payable for any of the previous year during the term of the policy exceeds 2,50,000, then this benefit shall not be available. And it shall be available only in respect to policies the aggregate premium whereof does not exceed 2.5 lakhs. So, this is something which we need to be very clear, because the intent of the government is to give relief to insurance policies, not for investment schemes camouflaged as insurance. However, the above provision will not apply in the event of death of a person. But that again is only for the second one. The second one talks about where the premium is payable for more than one ULIP issued on or after Feb 1st, 2021. Exemption under this clause shall be available only with respect to such policies where the aggregate does not exceed 2.5 lakhs. So it's per policy per annum. So of course, there's always this mechanism of multiple policies, multiple maturities. So all those are possible. Similarly, slump sale, friends, slump sale typically means where you sell a whole or part of an undertaking for a lump sum consideration. Now, at this point in time, if you see the income tax part, there is a section called 2 subsection 47, which defines the term transfer, and transfer includes different types of sale. So it could include sale, exchange, extinguishment, relinquishment, whatever. So there was this issue in the which went all the way up to Supreme Court, um, where should a slump sale only mean a sale and should not include exchange or otherwise. So since uh, transfer includes a series or a good number of instances of sale, like what we saw, renunciation, extinguishment, exchange, slump sale shall also include all the possibilities which are required for the same. Now, so the effective sum and substance of the amendment is even exchange will come under the ambit of slump sale. Even relinquishment can also possibly come under the ambit of slump sale as well. Transfer of capital asset to a partner on dissolution or reconstitution. So we have the section called 45.4 where it says that if a firm gets dissolved or a partnership firm gets dissolved, then the capital gain shall arise in the hands of the firm. And as far as a partner is concerned, whatever was the capital balance will be deemed as the cost of acquisition. And as far as a firm is concerned, whatever is the fair market value of the asset, that shall be deemed as a sale consideration. Now, what is the issue? The how to value under section 48. Section 48 talks about cost of acquisition. If the assets are revalued, self-generated assets are recorded in the books and payment is made to partner, which is in excess of his capital contribution. So how do you value such assets, or how do you handle such circumstances? So therefore, subsection 4A has now been introduced for transfer of any money or other assets which are technically your self-generated assets or revalued assets. So subsection 4A clearly talks about value of money, any money or fair market value of the other asset on the date of such receipt shall be deemed to be the full value of consideration received or accruing as a result of such transaction, and cost of acquisition shall be the capital account balance. And the newly inserted subsection 4, which substitutes the existing provision, says fair market value of the capital asset on the date of receipt shall be deemed to be the full value of consideration, and cost shall be as per the earlier provision. And the balance in capital account of the specified person in the books of accounts is to be calculated without taking into account the increase in capital of the specified person due to revaluation. This is something again very similar to when you do your slump sale net worth calculation, where you exclude the value of revaluation, because by by just doing a revaluation, you can increase the capital contribution and thereby increase the cost of acquisition for the partners. So to avoid that and to plug the loophole, this provision has been inserted. Next, fake invoices, provisional attachments. So, Section 271 AAD, inserted by the Finance Act 2020, imposed a penalty on someone who causes a fake entry to be created or omitted from his books of accounts, and penalty was provisional attachment. Now, the provisional attachment can be made for penalty under Section 271 AAD, where the amount or the aggregate amounts is likely to exceed 2 crores. So it's not for smaller cases, so the harassment is expected to come down. Next, what are the incentives? So what we've seen thus far was on rationalization of provisions. Now let's look at incentives. So if you have to look at the exemption for long-term LTC cash scheme. So during the leave travel concession is a benefit which is available for employees who receive LTC, and the relief is available twice every in a block of 4 calendar years. So given this background, uh, during COVID, it was announced that since people could not travel, LTC paid by cash would also be eligible for exemption. They have operationalized it by virtue of a provision under Section 10, subsection 5. But this is only for this financial year. It's a retrospective benefit with some relief. In case you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the group chat or individual chat. We'll certainly try and answer it, friends. Thank you. So, incentives for affordable rental housing. This was again a fairly emotive relief announcement, I would say, where the government felt by for the case of migrant workers, any affordable housing project which will be notified and which is created for the purpose of rentals subject to certain conditions which we are yet to get, that income shall be eligible for 100% deduction. So that's the piece. Yes. Yes. So the question from Karthik. Karthik's question is about. So is this similar to your affordable housing, where the benefit for tax holidays available? The same. Same affordable housing. Karthik, it comes under 80 IBA. Just that's for the developer when he sells, and this is when he gives it on rent. So we'll have to wait and watch for the fine print of the scheme to understand what is being mentioned. Next, tax incentives for units located in IFSC. I think this is one of the most important chapters as far as this particular budget is concerned. And personally, we are very, very elated this is happening because we're setting up our office in IFSC next month. So that's something which we're very excited to hear. So before I get into what this is all about, let's try and understand. I'll give you a background. Yes, I think the question from Rohan is yes, IFSC is the gift city. Yes, Gujarat International Financial FinTech City. So what technically happens in IFSC is tax incentives for units located in IFSC. So if we have to look at the vision for IFSC, it's like they wanted to create a Hong Kong or a Singapore within the territory of India, which effectively means it will be an offshore at this point in time, and you can hold bank balances in every currency other than INR. So that's the reason for this particular relief, and they want people to settle down in IFSC to increase the bandwidth. And this is again a fallout of various studies being done. The most popular one being the Surjit Balla committee report on this. Next, moving on. So at present, the government wants to make this a place like Hong Kong or Singapore, and they want foreign funds, foreign banks to set up their investment offices out of the IFSC. They've also expanded the scope of businesses which can look at being there. So one of the initiatives which have not taken off as much as the government thought it would was this particular provision, Section 9A. So any fund which has a fund manager who's based out of India will not be deemed as a permanent establishment of the fund if he fulfills the conditions prescribed under section 9A, because otherwise he creates a permanent establishment or a business connection, and things move on from this and things get a lot more complicated. But because of this particular, there were 17 conditions, friends. So because of this particular provision, what has happened is the government, there were very, very few people who were willing to take these uh, provisions. So what the government has did, what the government has done, the central government may by notification specify that any of the conditions prescribed in section 9A of the act shall not apply or shall apply with modification to an eligible investment fund or a fund manager if the fund manager is located in an IFSC and has commenced operations on or before 31/3/2024. So they've moved the power to the executive order, who would effectively be uh, if the IFSCA, the International Financial Services Authority. So he shall be effectively, the power will be delegated to him, and he shall in turn pass orders in terms of saying what provisions of 9A shall apply or shall not apply. I think that will be a phenomenal improvement in terms of what is possible with this provision, because the intent for the government is the fund manager has to be in India, has to be in Gift City, and the government wants to improve the ecosystem there. But with 17 conditions to be fulfilled and the fear of the taxman's sword always hanging on top, no one was willing to bite the bullet. But with this particular amendment, I'm sure there would be a lot of movement in the positive direction. I'm skipping these conditions primarily because this is how it existed. So you would see the list of conditions someone has to fulfill. I mean, it's crazy, because at the end of the 17th condition, you might end up violating the first few conditions. So that's how it always is with the regulations. Next, exemption of offshore banking units. So a lot of banks, be it Indian and foreign banks, have also set up an IFSC. So now what the government has done is they wanted to move the investment function, or move the investment function of these institutions to move to IFSC. So they've said it's proposed to provide exemption to any income which accrued or arisen or received to the investment division of the offshore banking unit to the extent attributable to it and computed in the prescribed manner. So therefore, they've made uh, consequential amendments to the definition of various relevant provisions like AIF registration and offshore banking unit. But this is the sum and substance. So the investment division's income shall also be eligible for exemption. Yes, Rajesh, you're right. So typically, let's say Citibank. The question is the bank's income or the investment income of the bank will be exempt. So let's say Citibank has an office in IFSCA. So the income of Citibank technically is eligible for exemption under 80 LA. 8 out of 10 years they have a tax exemption. Now, on top of it, now there's a specific exemption available for investment income, because this is not business income for the bank, but it's investment income. So if it's structured as a fund or a treasury unit of an offshore banking outfit, that would also be eligible for exemption under 80 LA. So here the exemption is equal to 100% of the income of the offshore banking unit and the units of IFSC for 10 out of 15 consecutive year, 15 financial years. Next. Um, Similarly, exemption on transfer of non-deliverable forward contracts on derivatives contracts entered into offshore banking unit of IFSC will also be eligible for exemption. Yes. Exemption on royalty income on aircraft. So this is very interesting, friends. So if you understand, nearly 81% of the aircrafts which are flying in India are leased aircrafts. So invariably, these would be leased out of jurisdictions like Panama, like Singapore or Ireland or any of these tax havens. So given this background, what happens is in uh, these leasing companies don't have tax obligations in their home jurisdiction. But if, let's say, Indigo takes an aircraft from an Irish company, and let's say Ireland, they've negotiated a tax deal, and they end up paying 1% or 2%, like what Apple does. But since based on India Ireland treaty, there's a 10 or a 15% withholding. So under such circumstances, the leasing company adds this 10 or 15% as cost and then gives it to Indigo. So for Indigo, the cost of withholding is an added straight bottom line item. It impacts its bottom line. And as we saw, as per CAPA, 81% of aircrafts are in India are leased once. So technically, the cost of leasing is a substantial part in the P&L of airlines, which are already bleeding this year. So given that background, this provision looks extremely welcome, where they say if the unit uh, is operating out of Gift City, then on any payment of royalty abroad, there is no withholding tax. So the leasing company from Ireland would technically have to set up an office in a Gift City, and Indigo will pay to that unit in Gift City. Since they anyway, by virtue of ATLA, they don't need to pay tax for 10 out of 15 years. There is no withholding on that. And from here, from the Gift City unit to the Irish company or wherever it is, there is again no withholding on payment of leasing income. So, friends, just to be clear, royalty leasing comes under the ambit of royalty, because the definition of the term royalty includes any consideration for financial, industrial, scientific, or commercial equipments. And this will be a game changer for the airline aviation industry. And this is another fabulous provision where the government has said, if you are relocating a fund, let's say from Mauritius or Singapore or Cayman to Gift City, there again, and you're a non-resident, there wouldn't be any capital gains on such relocation. Fantastic, fantastic provision. So, issuance of zero coupon bonds by infrastructure debt fund. So zero coupon bond as an instrument was recognized, but originally it was allowed to be issued only by infrastructure company or infrastructure fund. So now we're talking about infrastructure debt fund, because it's a new scheme of system which was allowed under the current budget. So even they can also issue the zero coupon bonds. Next, this is again an RBI volunteered initiative. RBI is not very happy with the number of cooperative banks in India and the scale and the magnitude of scams which are happening in cooperative banks. So therefore, there has been an effort to bring them under the fold of RBI. Now, to encourage these cooperative banks, the cooperative banks, to get into the formal sector, tax exemption is now being allowed by virtue of a series of amendments to bring them under the fold of RBI's purview. So, if an urban cooperative bank gets converted to a banking company, there is no tax cost by virtue of such conversion. Yes, I get a question from Umesh. Yes, so the issue is it similar to restructuring? The earlier form of restructuring included, I think we had 47(6) CA and CB, which talks about restructuring of cooperative banks. It was more in terms of consolidation, amalgamation, and mergers and stuff. This is more in terms of conversion. So this you can equate it to something similar to a 47(13) or 14B, where you convert from a proprietary concern to a company. Something very similar where you're converting it from an urban cooperative to a banking company. Next, facilitating strategic disinvestment. So this is again, every year we see this, at least the intent statement on the government trying to expand its collections by sale of assets through strategic disinvestments. This time also, our honorable finance minister said she's going to list LIC. So that will be a short way of getting money, especially given the way where markets are at this point in time. So it's proposed that to amend 219A of the Act, which 219A, friends, defines the term amalgamation, to clarify that reconstruction or splitting a public sector company into separate companies shall be deemed as demerger. So they're trying to make it as attractive as possible. And consequent to this, and they've also defined what a strategic disinvestment means, which shall means sale of a shareholding by central government or any state government in public sector company, which results in reduction of its shareholding to below 51%, along with transfer of control to buyer. So it is not listing; it is transferred to a significant majority or a significant minority buyer with transfer of control. So if we were to look at the amendment, the accumulated loss and unabsorbed depreciation of the amalgamating company in case of an amalgamation, which we saw, which is mentioned above, uh, which is deemed to be loss or as the case may be allowance for unabsorbed depreciation, shall not be more than the accumulated loss and unabsorbed depreciation of the public sector company as on the date on which a PSU ceases to be a PSU. So technically, even though you have your this overrides provisions of section 79, if there's change in control, you would still be eligible for the carry forward of losses. So the government is trying to make it supremely attractive to people to come and buy. Let's wait and watch if that happens. uh, yes, Air India, brilliant question. So it didn't strike me, but yes, Air India could be one on the agenda. Nabil, you're right. And the fact that Tatas have already uh, shown interest, I think this should be very much on the cards. So rationalization of provisions relating to sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. So again, friends, if you've seen, the government wants long-term money for infrastructure. So have already allowed in last year's budget, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and sovereign wealth funds. However, what they say is both these institutions, pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, shall invest in category 1 or 2 or AAF, having 100% investment in eligible infrastructure companies. So now they have reduced it from 100% to 50%. So the intent is to make it as easy as possible for these institutions to come on board. And again, CAT 1 and 2 AAF can invest in an enterprise in the business of developing, operating, and maintaining infrastructure facility. Now they can also invest in infrastructure investment trust, which is your Invictus, as we call it. So the government is trying to keep it as lucrative for people to invest, and expansion of avenues for asset monetization and investment of investment in infrastructure. Moving on, these are consequential amendments, thanks to the main ones. Just a sec. Okay. Next, addressing mismatch in taxation of income from notified overseas retirement funds. So this is again, let me tell you, give you a practical example. Let's say someone has worked abroad in UK for 25 years, is retired, he's getting pension in UK, and now he comes back to India, and then in UK his income is taxed on receipt basis. He gets his pension, but as far as India is concerned, his income gets taxed on accrual basis. Now, this becomes a serious case, right? I mean, on one side you have your income tax in one country, and you're already retired, you're a pensioner. So to remove this analogy for this set of people, the government has now said that your income will be taxed only on cash basis, that is on receipt basis. Similarly, as far as MAT is concerned, couple of very relevant adjustments have been considered. So now, since dividends are the two things, one, dividends are subjected to tax effective last year. Dividend. So to provide similar treatment to dividend as we have for capital gains on transfer of security, interest or royalty, because originally dividend was considered as part of exempt income. So now, since dividends are taxable, they would be treated as part of taxable passive income, like interest, capital gain, and royalty and fees for technical services in calculating book profit. And similarly, moving on with the our area of transfer pricing. So what happens when, see, you file your tax returns. See, friends, I'll just give you a 1 minute background on, or even less, on minimum alternate tax. Companies have this tendency of showing higher book profits as per Companies Act and a lower taxable profit for income tax purposes, primarily because of various accounting juggleries which are possible. Now, consequent to this, especially when it comes to public companies, their valuation is a function of the disclosed financials. So the value goes up, but they don't pay much tax. So income tax department felt this was not appropriate. So they said, if the tax as per tax provisions is lower than 15% of tax as per book, and what is book profit is mentioned, then you will pay tax on this, and this differential will be given to you as a prepaid tax credit, which you can set it out in a later year. Now, what happens tomorrow? My taxable profit is here, my book profit is here. And thanks to a transfer pricing adjustment, my taxable profit 2 years later goes up. But since my original filed book profit was here, taxable profit was here, I would have paid MAT tax when I was not required to. If adding this adjustment of transfer pricing, I wouldn't be even required to pay tax as per MAT. So now what they have said, if you've got a transfer pricing adjustment, we can go back and do a rectification under section 154, and rectification you have 4 years time from the time of the order, so you have ample time to do a rectification, and then your assessments will be handled accordingly. So that's the sum and substance, friends. Next, exemption of TDS on payment of dividends to business trust in whose hands the dividend is exempt. So again, friends, if we see the case of real estate investment trust, REIT or Invictus, you have an SPV, you have a real estate investment trust, and you have the investor. There are three layers. And if the SPV pays tax at 25%, the entire chain is exempt from paying taxes. So the SPV declares dividend to the trust in turn declares it to the investor. For the entire chain, the effective tax rate is only 25%. So that's the relief which the government has given. But since now dividend comes within the ambit of a taxable transaction in general, but for trusts, these are exempt. So you don't need to pay tax if it is 25%. The SPV pays tax at 25%. So for the SPV will pay tax at 25% and declare dividends which are exempt in the hands of the trust, tax free and TDS free. Because this was creating a lot of operational hassles. That's a very, very welcome initiative. Rationalization of provisions concerning withholding payment made to foreign institutional investors. If you look at section 196D, the Act provides for reduction of tax on income of FIIs from securities as mentioned in 115 AD, which is other than 194 LD. So you have the interest at 20%. And it is also, but what has happened in many cases, the DTA rate itself is less than 20%. So in such cases, there has been a conflict that TDS is not tax rate. TDS is only temporary deduction of taxes, and later when the assessments are finalized or when you file a return, if your real tax liability is only 10%, you claim the refund for the excess. But we all know how refunds work here. So to bring relief to FIIs, so what they have made it, TDS rates will also be subject to rates in force, and the rates in force shall mean your tax rate, TDS rate, or your DTA, whichever is lower. So technically, if your DTA rates are lower than your TDS rate, your DTA rate will be used for the purpose of TDS. That's the sum and substance of this amendment. Next, rationalization of provisions for tax audit. It's a boon as well as some concern for CAs. So what happens under 44 AB of the Act, every person carrying on tax audit threshold is 1 crore, and for professionals it is 50 lakhs. What they've said, if the income of the business is such that 95% of its receipts are by way of digital payments, then up to 5 crores they needn't go in for a tax audit. That's how the provisions were. Now the threshold of 5 crore is now pushed to 10 crores. And similarly, dividend income. Originally, advance tax, since dividend was made taxable, advance tax was applicable on dividends. but you don't know when dividend will be declared during a year. So to avoid that particular difficulty to the SSC, dividend will now be uh, advance tax will be payable on dividends similar to the way capital gains work. So in the ensuing period, advance tax has to be paid. So technically there is no advance tax on dividend as such. Yes. 1023C. So if you were to look at it, provides for exemption of income received by any person on behalf of different funds or institutions which are specified typically in the area of education. The present limit for exemption is 1 crore. As the Honorable Finance Minister said, this limit under 1023C is increased from 1 crore to 5 crores. And extending due date for filing returns in some cases and reducing time frame. So these are what I would say is procedural provisions where the reliefs are being made available to the SSC. Section 5A provides for taxation of spouses governed by Portuguese Civil Code. And on account of this provision, any income earned by a partner of a firm whose accounts are required to be audited shall be apportioned between the spouses and included in their total income if section 5A applies to them. And it's proposed that the due date for filing original return shall be extended to 31st of October in case of spouse of a partner whose accounts are required to be audited under the provision. So the spouse shall also be given the similar benefit. And when entering into an international transaction, in the case of a firm which is required to furnish transfer pricing, then the time frame is 30th of November for filing return. So similarly for the spouse who is governed by the Portuguese Civil Code, it shall be 30th of November. As much as we want, history doesn't leave us. So that's uh, it's nice to be considerate, even though it's a very, 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 very small fraction of people who would be benefited out of this provision. Similarly, where it is proposed that the last date of filing of belated or revised returns, as the case may be, is reduced by 3 months. Then the belated or revised return could now be filed 3 months before the end of the relevant assessment year or before completion of assessment, whichever is earlier. But this again is only for international transactions. Settlement Commission is proposed to be discontinued, and an interim board for settlement shall be set up, consisting of 3 members, each being an officer of the rank of Chief Commissioner, as may be nominated by the board. At present, if you notice, friends, Settlement Commission is a quasi-judicial body which was set up to settle tax liabilities and fairly complicated cases. And those who are eligible are people where the tax liability assessed income exceeding 10 lakh or 50 lakh in case of assessment pursuant to a search or a requisition. And they should have paid whatever is a tax which they are supposed to be agreeing to pay on the settlement when they apply for this. Next, reduction in time limit. So if you see the existing time limit under section 153 to pass an assessment order, it's coming down from 21 months to 18 months to now it's come down to 12 months, and then subsequently effective for assessment year commencing on or after 1/4/2021, it is reduced to 9 months. So the revenue does not have too much of time to sit on your cases. So the time limit for completion of assessment is only 9 months, and that's a fabulous reduction and relief as far as assessees are concerned. Because given your all this electronic piece and other things, I think uh, the need for assessment is also significantly come down. And as she was mentioning during the course of her speech also, going forward, we may not even require uh, filling of tax returns. It comes pre-filled. Apart from your 26As, even your capital gain transactions are now going to come pre-filled in your returns. So that's a big boon for the SSCs going forward. So rationalization of provisions with respect to equalization levy. So this is a levy which is currently under serious contention, primarily because of yes, larger OECD, larger nations, especially US, has taken strong offense to what India has been doing. Uh, just a sec, I'm getting a question. Yes, Rupa. So yes, at this point in time, India is still continuing. We are not. The question was, does India have any issue as far as equalization levy being continued? At this point, yes, we still have equalization levy continuing without any concern so far. So, what are the clarifications? The consideration received or receivable for specified services and for e-commerce supply or services shall not include consideration which are taxable as royalty or FTS. Primarily because this is one thing: equalization levy shall not include royalty or FTS because anyway they are taxed at 10 or 15% as per the treaty. So there is no need. And that for the purpose of defining e-commerce supply or service, online sale of goods and online provision of services shall include a list of services which include placing of purchase order, acceptance of PO, supply of goods partly or wholly, and consideration received or receivable shall include consideration for sale of goods irrespective of whether e-commerce operator owns the goods. So it includes marketplaces, and consideration for provision of services, again irrespective of whether service is provided or facilitated by the e-com operator. And it's also proposed to include section 1050, which will apply to e-commerce supply or services made or provided on or after 1st of April 2020. And it clarified that the exemption shall 1050 will not apply for royalty and FTS because there is no equalization levy on those transactions, so regular tax will apply. To define e-commerce supply or services under 1050 as the meaning assigned to it under Chapter 8 of the Finance Act, that's the provision based on which equalization levy was introduced. So depreciation on goodwill, friends. So this has again been a question of a lot of debate. I'm not getting into whether goodwill, whether they are right or wrong or the uh, case, but we've had serious concerns in terms of is goodwill a depreciable asset or not. So finally, after good amount of argument, because we can talk for 1.5 hours only on this particular amendment itself. Uh, Goodwill in general is not a depreciable asset. Hence, there appears to be little justification for depreciation on goodwill, even in the category of the cases mentioned. So, the government stand going forward is that goodwill won't be a depreciable asset. So, it will not. So, block of assets under section 2, subsection 11 shall very clearly exclude goodwill from its ambit. So, we won't be able to take it within the ambit of the 25% wherever we have purchased for it, but it will be a capital asset which when we sell we should be able to get the cost being reduced. Next, rationalization of provisions relating to processing of returned income and issuance of notice. Again, section 143 relating to processing of returns after considering the below adjustments. Increase in income indicated in the audit report but not taken into account for computing total income. So the following adjustments shall be made. Notice shall be issued. Sorry. So notice shall be issued under 143 after making the following adjustment: increase in the income indicated in the audit report but not taken into account in computing total income. Consequential effect to amendments carried out under 80AC, and amend the provisions of 143 to reduce the time limit for sending the intimation under 143.1. Again, the time limit for sending intimation under 143.1 talks about summary assessment, friends. So see, there are two types of, typically when you look at assessments, there's something called 143.1 which is a summary assessment where the assessment is based on the return of income filed by the SSC, and whatever is the adjustment basis the returns file, like what we are seeing here, a change in income basis the tax audit report will be added and the notice will be issued. Second, 143, the mere acknowledgement of return is a summary assessment order under 143.1. And then you have something called a scrutiny assessment under 143.3, for which a notice under 143.2 needs to be issued. What we are now seeing is 143.1 summary assessment. So adjudicating authority for the purpose of prevention or prohibition of Benami Properties Act. Since there is no appointment of adjudicating authority under the Benami Act, the adjudicating authority under PMLA is discharging the functions under this act, and it is now proposed to provide that the competent authority constituted under Smugglers and Foreign Exchange Manipulation Act shall be the adjudicating authority for the Benami regulation as well. Presumptive taxation for professionals under 44 DA. So there is this issue. This is the reason for whether LLPs are required to fall within this ambit or otherwise. So it's proposed to make the position very clear that provisions of this section shall apply to an SSE being an individual, HUF or a partnership firm not being an LLP. So the presumptive provision of 44 ADA will not apply to LLPs. Again, as regards Vivad Se Vishwas provisions, this was again introduced to minimize litigation. And with the view to remove any ambiguity, it's proposed to amend the provisions to clarify that the original intent of the legislation, for which the definition of appellant, disputed tax, and tax arrear of Vivad Se Vishwas are proposed to be amended to remove any ambiguities which have been covered by this particular bill. So again, the intent is to bring about a lot more transparency. Income declaration scheme. Again, a proviso was inserted in 191 of the Finance Act 2000, which empowered the board to issue an income declaration scheme. That's when this 30 and 15% penalty was introduced. So 45% penalty. I'm getting a question from Joe. Yes, Joe. Yes, the scheme is still there are assessments still pending in that scheme. It's now proposed to amend the proviso of 191 so as to provide that excess amount of tax, surcharge, or penalty paid in pursuance of a declaration made under the scheme shall be refundable without any payment of interest. So, which is why, so this answers, the amendment answers your question. TDS on purchase of goods. New provision 194Q, which talks about TDS on purchase of goods at 0.1%. The compliance is only on those who can comply with it. It's proposed that tax is only required to be deducted by those, which is the buyer, whose sales or gross receipts carried on exceeds 10 crores during the financial year, immediately preceding the year in which the goods have been purchased. So for the earlier year, if it exceeds 10 crores, then he's supposed to deduct TDS. Tax is required to be deducted by such person if the purchase of goods from the seller exceeds 50 lakhs during the previous year. So the buyer should have 10 crores or above in terms of turnover for the earlier year, and the seller must be selling in aggregate 50 lakhs during the previous year. Then 0.1% shall be applicable TDS. And then TDS and TCS on non-filers at a higher rate. Just one sec. Yes, this is a new insertion. This is section 194Q. So this is something which we will have to be concerned about going forward. I think this is one of the pain points which has been introduced in this budget. I've not seen any serious pain points so far. Again, 206 AB is being proposed to insert a special provisions for providing a higher rate of TDS, and 206 CCA for a higher rate of TCS for non-filers of income tax. So this section shall not apply where the tax is required to be deducted under 192 interest, 192A, 194B, BB, and LBC and N. So if the SSE does not file the returns, then the TDS shall be at the higher of the following rates: twice the rate specified, twice the rate or rates in force, or at 5%, whichever is higher. So, and if the provisions of 206A of the Act is applicable, then again, in addition to the provisions of this section, the tax shall be deducted at higher of the two rates, which includes 206A. Similarly, for TCS also, it's twice the rate or 5%. So this is a punishment. If you don't file tax returns, your TDS or TCS rates will be on the higher side. And it's twice the regular rate. Taxability on various funds which are where the income is exempt. We saw that with 1010D, even where insurance maturity on insurance policies where the annual premium exceeds 2.5 lakhs, you cease to get the benefit of insurance exemption. It's proposed to insert 10 subsection 11, which talks in section 10 subsection 11. 1011 talks about exemptions with respect to payment from a provident fund. and claustral exemption with respect to accumulated balance, uh, which become due and become payable, where the provisions of these clauses shall not apply to interest income accruing during the previous year in the account of the person to the extent it relates to the amount or aggregate amounts of contribution made by the person exceeding 2.5 lakhs in a previous year in that fund. So if you're going to invest more than 2.5 lakhs in that fund, you may not be eligible for interest exemption or withdrawal from provident funds. But yes, currently the limit is only 1.5 lakhs. So I'm not even sure if you're allowed to invest more than that. So yes, friends. So these were the amendments on the direct taxes front. There was a fairly long, it was about 70 odd amendments. Even though the speech was only for about 8 to 10 minutes on direct taxes, one good thing she did was she didn't change the rates. So otherwise, every year we keep getting some rate or the other. So she didn't change the tax rates. But otherwise, one of the more progressive budgets we have seen over the last 9, 10 years. Seriously, I mean, it checks almost all important tick boxes, and it was a home run as far as Gift City is concerned. Yes, getting certain questions. Yes, yes, Supli, we'll share the presentation surely. It will be put in the group. I think we just have to do some editing in terms of the quantum of content. I think then we shall be shared, and we'll also quickly run through with what I would say is uh, the size of the government's balance sheet. Okay, so what's happened? If just give me a sec. I don't have it. So currently it's about 35 lakh crores. So maybe we shall spend another conversation on the economic aspects and the P&L of the government. So no, yeah, we don't focus on indirect taxes. So it's not an indirect taxes. It's only on the budget, and probably we'll also do on direct taxes, and we'll also be doing on the economic aspects of the budget. So that's where it is. So any specific questions, please do mail it to us. We'll be more than glad to revert. And once again, thanks for joining us today. Thank you.